What is up, my plaid of people? Welcome to the Periaki, my channel, where we are working our way through the Answering LDS Truth Claim series here now on episode 14. We are wrapping up the Book of Mormon with this one. Pretty exciting stuff. We are finishing up the Book of Mormon, something that's been a long time coming. So in the last episode, we went through Brett McDonald's arguments for this new world context of the Book of Mormon with the pride cycle and the modes of warfare. Those arguments we evaluated from the range of fallacious to at best just being nothing burgers. So as we conclude Book of Mormon apologetics, will we finally get something that's at least halfway decent? Or was NHM, the whole bountiful old world geography connection, just the best evidence that's on offer? Well, we all probably know the answer to that question already, but strap in just in case McDonald's able to snatch victory from the jaws of fallacy. This presentation, which is ostensibly about Lamanite culture, it starts off with a bit from the discourse of King Benjamin. McDonald rehearses some of the things that Benjamin claimed to have accomplished during his reign. He then offers the contention that this is done so that Benjamin can contrast himself with the non-Nephite kings. Does Benjamin say that that's what he's doing, though? Well, of course not. You know what this series is about at this point. McDonald takes something from the text, adds a bit of spice to it, and claims that it has always been so seasoned. Why should this particular section here at the end of the Book of Mormon be any different? So here's an alternative explanation to what we actually see in the text. Maybe Benjamin was just placing himself in contrast to prior Nephite kings, or to the kings of Judah and Israel. Or maybe he was just trying to set the stage for how his discourse, like his earlier work, would be a reflection of his desire to serve and sustain his people. All of these ideas are just as consistent, if not even more consistent, with the text than McDonald's assertion. It's really just a bad argument here from McDonald. Now, I will note that there are actually some really interesting ways of using King Benjamin's discourse to try and actually distance the Book of Mormon from Joseph Smith authorship, but that doesn't get treated here, so we'll move past that. In the next section, called Over Kingship and Interstate Visits and Chariots, MacDonald talks about the Lamanite practice of having regional kings who are subsumed under the control of an overking. He ties this back to the similar practices among the Maya. We could, of course, draw parallels to feudalism or a sort of chiefdom with lower chiefs and high chiefs. Heck, even the priesthood structure in the Old Testament follows this pattern. In other words, at best, this is a nothing burger for distinguishing between naturalistic and historical authenticity models, and at worst, this is just the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Again, regardless, it is the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Now, at this point, it does bear reminding that just because an argument is fallacious, that does not necessarily mean that the conclusion is incorrect. It just means that the conclusion cannot be logically reached from the premises that are presented. In other words, one cannot build a preponderance case, or even a reasonableness case, on the basis of fallacious arguments. I point out fallacies not to say definitively that MacDonald is wrong, but to point out that his case fails to meet the burden of proof that he's put forward. The next section, called The Treatment of Captives, really fares no better. The Lamanites treat the sons of Mosiah poorly for a long time. Sometimes the Maya, like many other cultures, would hold prestigious captives for a long time and use them as a way to denote dominance. Say with me now, this is at best a nothing burger, but it's the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Now, for the last section on Lamanite culture, the anti-Nephi Lehis and the cult of war, MacDonald just presents the most tenuous connection of that he possibly could to Maya history. The links are so tenuous that I'm actually not even sure that it actually qualifies as the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. To explain, MacDonald discusses the role of bloodletting and sacrifices to gods in Maya warring culture. He ties this to the oaths made by the people of Ammon to renounce their weapons of war. I honestly hope that he was able to get ice on that before he pulled anything from that stretch. And I'm really at a loss of what I'm supposed to argue here. There's just no real connection here. Look, show me a site where hundreds or thousands of people were slaughtered by an invading army without any resistance, and we might actually start to have something, especially if you can find a huge cache of buried weapons on the site. Really, until then, this is just parallelomania. We now move on to the section that MacDonald calls the dreadful groanings, and that is what I have been experiencing when evaluating these apologetics so far in the last few episodes. MacDonald puts forward the argument that 3rd Nephi 8 sure sounds a lot like a volcanic explosion, and I'm actually inclined to agree with him here. Generally, though I don't think that's what the text is really trying to describe. But that said, there are enough similarities that we can really just run with it for the sake of argument. Where we kind of run into a problem is with the vapors of darkness. 3 Nephi 8:21 tells us that fire could not be kindled even with exceedingly dry wood. The darkness also persists for a period of days, or maybe 36 hours. Jesus really did only kind of give up a weekend. So, what could cause even dry wood to not be able to burn? Well, anything that could cause such a phenomenon would be the most probable cause of the extensive deaths in the affected area. The lack of oxygen and the chokingly thick ash would make breathing, including like what's described as like wailing and weeping and crying, extremely difficult. To share kind of a personal experience, there was a time in my youth when there was like a very large forest fire that was slowly approaching our area. The forest fire never actually arrived in my town, but it was starting to get kind of close and a little bit worrying, and a whole bunch of ash started to blow in, and the air was just really choked with the ash, but we were far from the fire. It really wasn't that thick of ash, but the air quality was so bad that it actually became hard to breathe when being outside. And so one could only imagine just how bad it would be if the air is like so thick with ash, with these mists of darkness in the form of this ash from volcanic eruption, that not even wood could be burned, dry wood. Now, I've read through Jerry Grover's text, Geology of the Book of Mormon, on this, and it really doesn't actually provide an adequate answer to this particular issue. So next we talk about Quetzalcoatl and Jesus, and we should move on from this pretty quickly because this is an apologetic that just needs to be abandoned. And fortunately, McDonald agrees with me, and I would go so far as to say that McDonald makes actually a lot of really good points here. Like, kudos, McDonald. This is great. I wish that this was like the standard that you applied to like everything else that you presented in the series. Now, finally, we come to the demise of the Nephites. First, we get a return to form pointing out that Mormon talks about a population explosion and that there is a potential parallel with the Maya having a population boom around the same time as Mormon 1. Actually, McDonald doesn't really give that time frame. He just says that the Maya population grew. I sort of just accidentally Mott and Bailey McDonald's argument. But honestly, if you don't add the timeline relationship, then like really what's the point of saying that there's growth in both the Nephite and the Maya populations? Next, McDonald discusses the land northward, connecting Teotihuacan to the land northward. His conclusion to this section is that the Nephite destruction fits comfortably into the culture of Teotihuacan. But does it? Teotihuacan was an important trading site, and I can grant to McDonald that much. It achieved the apex of its population around 400 CE. But that's the time when the Nephite civilization would be eradicated. Such a word would be costly, to say the least. We really do believe that a city which was like thriving on trade achieved the zenith of its success right on through a genocidal conquest of a potential trading partner. That makes little strategic sense. The more likely objectives would be of the sort consistent with what was like discussed in the previous video, namely like subjugation and control. So no, this really doesn't actually fit. We would actually expect a contraction of the population around 400 CE if such a conflict had taken place, like as the dead warriors would need to be replaced and the loss of trading infrastructure would also need to be rebuilt. Residents of Teotihuacan in such a scenario would be incentivized to leave the city for the recently vacated lands, such as the horrific and disgusting nature of genocidal conflict. And with that, we're at the end of the Book of Mormon. While the Old World apologetics were quite weak, there was at least something interesting to discuss with NHM and Bountiful. Once we got to the New World, the quality of the apologetics just crashed hard. At the absolute best, McDonald gave us nothing burgers. Regardless, this section of the presentation was a string of Texas sharpshooter fallacies and parallelomania. So in the next episode, we're going to get into the Book of Abraham. This should prove interesting, as the Book of Abraham is often regarded as the smoking gun of the inability of Joseph Smith to actually translate ancient Egyptian documents. But that is going to have to wait until the next video. Until then, thank you so much for watching this one. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, do all the fun YouTube things, and I will catch you in the next one. Later.